Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Historical Snapshots Conversations. Our guest today is historian Dr. Claire Hubbard Hall, author of Secret Servants of the Crown, The Forgotten Women of British Intelligence. The book shares the remarkable and important story of the many vital contributions women have made and whose stories history has largely left untold. It will be the topic of our discussion. Claire, welcome, and thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to talking about a remarkable group of women.
Awesome. Well, to get started, what are the origins of British intelligence?
Well, the starting point is with an organisation that was founded at the beginning of October 1909 called the Secret Service Bureau. And it consisted of two men that headed up two sections. One was the Home section, which dealt with everything threats happening on British soil. And that was headed up by a chap called Vernon Kell, who was an army officer. He was 36 years of age, a brilliant linguist, and perfectly suited for the role. The other section was known as the Foreign section, which was headed up by a slightly older chap, a former Navy Admiral, Mansfield Smith Cumming, otherwise known as Mansfield Cumming. And the reason why the organisation was set up at this time is it was in the run-up to the First World War, when Germany was expanding its navy and sort of flexing its imperial muscles. And Britain was worried that it might be invaded or Germany might declare war at any point. And unfortunately, this is an interesting bit of history as to how this organisation came about, is that it was actually fueled by spy writers, fiction writers, because they whipped up a complete spy frenzy before 1909, before the Secret Service Bureau was founded. And they wrote lots of stories, books, short stories that appeared in newspapers about German agents and saboteurs running amok on home soil in Britain, causing havoc and collecting secret military information and sending it back to Germany. So this, of course, caused a complete panic with the British public, who were convinced that there were thousands of German agents on British soil. Of course, there weren't at all. But this was one of the reasons why the Secret Service Bureau was set up. And the Home section and the Foreign section are the organisations which then later bore MI, the Home section, became MI5 later on during the First World War, which is still in existence today and deals with domestic security. And then you had the Foreign section, out of which is born MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, as it's formally known. But to the Bond people, it's known as MI6. So that's kind of the origins as to the reasons why this secret service first came about.
Fascinating. And so then when do women come into the story?
So women are there from the very beginning, when the Secret Service Bureau was founded, when Mansfield Cumming needed to build up his number of external agents operating overseas to collect information on Germany and send it back to the UK. And then you have Vernon Kell, who is trying to set up various processes and working alongside the police to monitor any threats on British soil. And to do that, he obviously needs to come up with systems, processes of gathering information, storing it, processing it, archiving it. And of course, for these two different sections, women step forward in terms of filling those roles. And when it comes to the Foreign section, the first female agent, remarkably, was employed in December of 1909, so just a few months after the Bureau was founded. And her name was Agnes Blake, and her camouflage was absolutely perfect because she was a middle-aged widow who worked as a translator, and she travelled to and from Germany for her work, where she engaged in literary translation. So travelling as a widow, she wouldn't be thought suspicious of the time because, of course, she was widowed, whereas if you were an unmarried woman travelling without a male chaperone, that would have certainly caused questions to be asked or assumptions to be made, perhaps, that you may have been engaged in other kinds of work, other kinds of nefarious underhand work. So Agnes Blake was employed in December 1909, and remarkably, we would never ever have known her true identity. She worked under the alias of Agent A, which is perhaps not as remarkable given her first name was Agnes, but she was employed on the basis that she could collect information on German military officers because her sister had married much decades earlier, had married the equerry to the future Kaiser Wilhelm II. So they were ultimately connected in the right circles in terms of knowing top military officers within Germany. And Agnes rather bravely collected information, names, details on these men, and then travelled back with the information and passed it to Mansfield Cumming, the chief of MI6, otherwise known as C. She also helped in the office when she wasn't travelling. So she would translate German reports. She would help with the mountain of paperwork that was piling up on his desk, engaging in typing. And the reason that we know about her identity is because within the National Archives of the UK in London, Kew, there is some rather dusty old accounting files of the Secret Service Bureau. And within those files are letters that Agnes wrote complaining about her reduction in pay. Because into 1910, the very beginning of 1910, the MI6 paymaster decided that Mansfield Cumming was paying his agents too much money. So he halved all of their pay, basically. And Agnes was not happy at this at all. And she voiced her discontent to the fact that she spoke with somebody within the Foreign Office who was a close friend and was in the know. But somehow this got back to the MI6 paymaster, and who took offence that she had actually broken her trust and spoken about this secret organisation to somebody who wasn't actually employed within what would become MI6. So she was given her marching orders rather unfairly and given a very small amount of money that didn't cover her travel expenses as the minimum. And this is what she was complaining about in the letter, that she'd been treated unfairly. And there's a number of correspondence that goes backwards and forwards until finally, at the end of the year, December 1910, she finally manages she's wore them down so much that she eventually gets all her expenses paid with a little bit more. And they ask her whether she wants to stay on and work as an agent, and she politely declines. So that is the story of Agnes Blake. And the only thing I can think of when I came across her letters is that they're handwritten, and it's rather a loopy handwriting style, which did take a couple of days to transcribe. So I can only think that historians have looked at them and thought, no, that's going to take too long, and didn't really understand their historical significance. So Agnes Blake goes down in history. She's written back into history as the first woman to be an agent working for MI6, which is absolutely fantastic. And I think a testament to the fact that she did collect this information at great personal risk says something in terms of her strength of character. Now, on the other side, going to MI5, Vernon Kell's home section, women step forward, but in a very different capacity. One that there's a particular piece of machinery that's key at the turn of the 20th century, the typewriter, which opens the door for women into the world of the office. And of course, the secret world of intelligence exists mainly due to the fantastic paperwork that they are able to gather, collate and store and use, whether it's trying to find enemies or combat particular different types of external or internal threats. And they build up this massive amount of paperwork, which is housed in what was called the registry. So in terms of women stepping forward in MI5, The first woman to be employed by MI5 is a lady called Dorothy Westmacott, and she was employed as a typist in January 1911. So just over a year after the Secret Service bureaus had formally been founded. And she's employed because her father, James Westmacott, is the head clerk to Vernon Kell. So this is well before the days of professional vetting within the intelligence services. And a lot of these women were recruited on that extension of trust. They had a male relative who could vouch for their trustworthiness. She was undoubtedly recruited because her father said that she could be trusted, and she stepped forward into that role, and she worked for MI5 until the end of the First World War in what was known as the Secretariat. So she worked in those very early processes of compiling paperwork, which involved obviously typing up reports, etc. But those very early kind of processes of organising information on individuals who have been identified as perhaps being a German agent or suspected of being a German agent on British soil. And they slowly compile these profiles, and then those profiles turn into files, and then those files have to be stored in some way. And this all develops into how the registry comes about. So women are really key in terms of setting up these processes, these information gathering processes at the very, very beginning, as well as being there right at the beginning in terms of operating as a field agent, essentially, in the case of Agnes Blake. So 2 fantastic stories about women who had previously been lost to history.
And so how is this in relation to what working life of women in Britain at the time look like?
So at the turn of the 20th century, women it's what's called the white blouse revolution. So women are replacing men within that office environment. And it very much is the typewriter that is opening the door for them. And lots of women, when they leave school, go and enter secretarial training colleges, of which there are many different types located throughout the country. Some of them have direct routes into government departments or organisations like the police. So there is a professionalisation of women entering the workforce. And of course, this is all happening alongside the suffragette movement, votes for women, equality for women, and of which some of these women who enter into British intelligence, they are doing it because they are seeking a career. They're seeking economic independence without having to be married and relying on their husband for an income. So it's a fascinating time. If you look at the British census of the population that's taken every 10 years, we can see that in 1901, I think is around about 5,000 women report that they worked as a typist on the UK census. Several decades forward, you get to the 1921 census, and that has exploded to over 122,000 women reporting that their occupation is a typist. So that gives you a sense of the change that has occurred. And of course, after the end of the First World War, women for the first time in Britain are awarded the vote. Obviously, it's only a small group of women over a certain age, and they own landed property. Change would come much later, 1928 and then the 1960s. But women are slowly chipping away in terms of equality. And that pattern is followed through in the intelligence services.
That is quite the change pretty quickly. And so then going back to women in intelligence, how is their experience different from the experience of a man working in the department?
So women, ultimately, their entry point into the intelligence services is always through the clerical route. So they start off in the office, whereas men, it was a very different experience because they could achieve officer rank, whereas that was not available as an option to women in either MI5 The first female officer in MI5 was a lady called Jane Sismore, and she had to wait till 1929 before that change happened within unlike MI5, who was declassified and released a significant amount of its historical reports into the National Archives in Kew, London. MI6 is perhaps one of the world's most secretive intelligence services and has yet to release any of its historical reports into the archives, and that doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. So it's very difficult to identify when change came, when were the first female officers in MI6. We can try and gauge, but we don't know the exact date. We can just surmise from the types of work that they were doing. So women, they would enter into the clerical route, into the back rooms of British intelligence, and they would then either stay within that area, or if they were identified by their male colleagues or bosses as having a particular talent for a particular area within the intelligence work, would be able to move from the clerical level into different roles. So we see during the First World War and the Second World War that women are able to move into areas of work that wouldn't normally have been open to them. So they become case officers of agents themselves, a role that was usually only open to men. They head up sections within particular areas of intelligence work. They may have gone into photography. They may be working in invisible ink, working alongside male colleagues as a team, perhaps taking a leadership role. And this is the world wars that open the door, because obviously there is a lack of manpower because men are at the fighting front. So they are able to go into these different types of roles. But usually the experience of a woman is starting in the clerical role. And even when we get to the 1960s and 70s, that still seems to be the route, whereas obviously for men it was a far different experience, a much more open and one of choice, where women didn't have such great choice to start off with.
For women, as they became heads of departments or took on different roles, did it stay that way even when men came back from war?
No, unfortunately not. So during both world wars, during any period of conflict, the intelligence services obviously had to grow to respond to the increased amount of work. So that was why these women were able to step forward into roles that they wouldn't normally perform. And I must say that they performed these usually without the rank and the pay that their male colleagues had. So they were working for less and without the acknowledgement of rank, of officer rank. So the intelligence services expanded during war. And then once war was over and the threat was perceived to have been extinguished, they obviously then contracted. So they grew incredibly small again. And of course, that led to a massive talent drain, because all these women that had stepped forward to serve their country suddenly were found, they were being told that they weren't needed anymore and they were to return to civilian life, which really did result in a massive talent drain for the intelligence services.
And so besides the wars, were there other times or policies that did contribute to expanding the roles for women in intelligence?
So in the book, I make the argument that it's a very slow process. Women are having to prove themselves continuously, despite being told no, no, no. They go yes, yes, yes. And there are select key women in select moments that edge the argument forward for greater equality, but it takes an incredible amount of time. The wars help in terms of where women are able to prove themselves, but unfortunately, after each war ended, it's almost sort of going, you take so many steps forward during the war, after the war, you take so many steps back. So it just sort of slows down the process of change and moving forwards. But the women are persistent, they are determined, and they are incredibly talented and incredibly hardworking. And eventually, the little taps at the glass ceiling eventually get shattered. But it isn't right up until, well, I would probably say the defining point in the intelligence services is when Stella Rimington becomes the first female Director General of MI5 in 1992. So that's an incredible amount of time to go. But she's able to get there because of the progress that's been made by other women who've come before her and sort of trod the path so that she can walk that same path but try and edge a bit forward. So you have, starting off the process, probably I would argue, is the women who head up various sections in MI5 during World War One. You then have Jane Sismore in 1929, who becomes the first female officer, perhaps one of MI5's greatest counterintelligence officers. And then you have women like Millicent Baggott, who after the Second World War becomes the first assistant director in MI5, first female assistant director in 1953, and various other women that come after that lead to that path for Stella Rimington being able to really take a sledgehammer to that glass ceiling. Now, of course, if we look at MI6, it's much harder to try and determine exactly how much change has happened and when, because again, we don't have the records. But the ultimate piece of information is that they have yet to appoint a woman as C. And we're now in the 21st century. There have been women that have been in the running in the 80s and 90s, but ultimately the argument that I make in the book is that women are only going to get change when men decide it's going to happen. So that's why it takes so long.
And in terms of the roles themselves, how desirable are these roles, and what is the social perception of women who work in intelligence in Britain throughout the years?
So do you mean how they saw themselves or how others saw them?
I guess when I asked, I thought how others saw them, but I think actually both questions are really interesting.
Okay, so it's an interesting question because ultimately women could work in the intelligence services as long as they didn't get married. There was a marriage bar in place for MI5, the Home Office, until the end of the Second World War. For those in MI6, Foreign Office, it was the 1970s when the marriage bar was finally removed. There are some anomalies, though, of women who had careers within MI5 and MI6 who did actually marry, and some of them have children before 1945. So Jane Sismore is an example. She married a fellow MI5 officer who they married just days before the Second World War broke out, and she was able to remain in post. And then you have an MI female officer, Teddy Dunlop, who worked under ambassadorial cover in Tangier in the embassy there when she got married and brought up her young daughter, kicking at her heels while she was engaged in intelligence work during World War II and the early 1950s, of which her daughter went into secret work as well later on, much later on. So there are examples of anomalies to the rule, but for those careerist women like Kathleen Pettigrew, who was the inspiration for Ian Fleming's Miss Moneypenny character, Kathleen Pettigrew served 3 consecutive heads of MI6 and had a very distinguished career in Britain's Secret Service, but she never got married. Had she have got married, she would have had to have left her job. So when I was writing the book, I mean, there is an element of one wonders how lonely these women, these career women were, because essentially MI6 in these early days became your family, because of course you couldn't tell anybody what your true work was, who you were working for. These women just said, the occupational label of saying I'm a secretary is suitably vague and the perfect camouflage for women in intelligence. It doesn't arouse any suspicions at all. But to do so Kathleen Pettigrew basically had very little to do with her family. She sort of distanced herself throughout her life because those in MI6 became essentially the secret world, became the only world that she existed in, which I think there must have been an element later on once you leave MI6 and those that you knew slowly pass away and you're essentially become the last one that's left. Must be a sense of loneliness as a consequence of serving your country in a secret capacity. The other thing that I always think about these women in terms of social perceptions about themselves is whether they thought of the irony for those women who were working in a secret capacity that signed the Official Secrets Act or had it read to them and they agreed to it, whether they thought there was any irony in that they were being trusted to keep state and military secrets, but they weren't deemed worthy enough of the vote, which is quite a paradox to be in. So I always found that quite interesting to reflect on. And of course, what those around them who weren't in the know in terms of perceiving them, I mean, they probably would have had no suspicions at all because they would have simply just have been told that those individuals were working as secretaries or stenographers or working on the telephones or messengers or in the canteen or cleaning. These are all roles that every other business area has. It's no different in the secret world, but they usually mean that they're a cover and they work pretty well.
So in your book, you highlight many of these remarkable women, and I imagine all are special to you. But is there one who really stands out?
So the book began with the first woman that I started researching when I decided I was going to try and write women in British intelligence and their history. So the first woman I picked was Kathleen Pettigrew, who I've just previously mentioned, who was the inspiration for Ian Fleming's Miss Moneypenny character, an MI6 career woman who was the ultimate personal assistant, quartermaster, secretary, you name it, to the MI6 chiefs, from Mansfield Cumming through to Stuart Mingus, the MI6 head during World War II. In many ways, the book almost didn't get written because I began with her, because I suddenly realised how incredibly hard it was going to be to write about the MI6 women, for the very reason that I couldn't go to the archive and find them so readily like I could for the other services like MI5, the other wartime secret services. And she almost was like a ghost. I just couldn't quite get at her. I thought, goodness me, is this book possible? Anyway, I spent years researching her, and I almost had to I liken myself in the book to a counterintelligence officer, because I had to sort of gather up and try and identify and get my hands on any kind of piece of information relating to Kathleen Pettigrew. Didn't matter how small or insignificant it appeared. And then I had to try and build the picture up, and I had to try and follow leads, and I went down so many rabbit holes. But slowly, like a counterintelligence officer, you build the picture up, and I was able to get a sense of how key she was in terms of MI6's history, that she was there right at the kind of key moments in history. So she probably sat in on the interview when Mata Hari was arrested at the docks in Britain during World War One and taken for her interview. She was probably the woman that was in the room that was taking down the questions that were asked to her, and then Mata Hari's responses. And no doubt for another, whole host of other suspected enemy agents, of which I did manage to find evidence of her. And remarkably, this is where looking at the other details on reports rather than just the content, you can find evidence of these women's agencies. So I managed to find some other interview transcripts from the First World War, and Kathleen had typed her initials in the top left-hand corner of the report, KP, which was a eureka moment, which was fantastic. So I was able to gather all this type of information up right through to the Second World War, where she becomes visible, because when the Foreign Office have released certain historical files, wartime files, to the National Archives, they go through a process of being weeded. So they take out any secret information or MI6 files that shouldn't be in there. So they remove them and then send the files on. But luckily for us historians, sometimes the weeders let things slip through. What has slipped through into National Archives, if you can sit patiently for many days and weeks, is that you start to be able to notice that within the reports in the folders of the archives, that there are little chits attached to reports. And there was Kathleen Pettigrew. She had made notes, there were dates, quests for certain things. So you then able to get a sense of what she was actually working on. And what was passing her desk was pretty key, central to the Second World War, and it was all the Enigma decrypts ultra that was coming out of Bletchley Park. Britain's code-breaking centre, the big brain of British intelligence, was passing her desk under the auspices of Stuart Mingus, and MI6's role was then to decide who the information would be most key and pertinent to, and then they would send it off to the various, whether it was Army, Navy, Air Force or other services, and that's how the information was shared. So it's incredible. You start to build up this picture of this woman who has been key, so central from the First World War through to the Second World War, which was really, really remarkable to kind of piece together. Unfortunately, it is very fragmentary because that's the nature, unfortunately, of the type of the subject, of the secrecy that still surrounds the large part of exactly what she was doing. And I hope in the future that further light will be shed on the actual precise details, perhaps, of what she worked on. But she was deemed worthy enough to be awarded the MBE at the end of the Second World War. And then when she retired at the end of the 1950s, she was given the OBE, which again speaks volumes as to her length of service and her achievements that she had made. So Kathleen Pettigrew is, I think, perhaps very, very key to this book, which is why her story is woven from the beginning to the end of the book as an example of how certain women were present at these key moments. And she basically witnessed the professionalization of MI over the course of the first half of the 20th century, which is incredible, which is why in retirement in Devon, in Sidmouth, the MI6 would occasionally send a car from London to pick her up, to take her to headquarters, perhaps because she was a walking, talking history book that she, if they had questions, she was the woman to go to, which is incredible.
I know this is probably very challenging in terms of researching women who worked in intelligence, but did you also get a sense of what was she like? What was her personality like?
Well, so unfortunately, she's one of the women who I couldn't, because of I didn't have the material as to try and gauge her personality like I did some of the other women in the book, who I managed to, through tracking down family relatives, was able to unearth private collections which consisted of diaries, letters, which really gave a sense of the women's personality. And I was able to breathe life into them in the book. With Kathleen Pettigrew, she remains out of my reach, unfortunately. And if I've done my job correct in the book, by the time the reader gets to the end, they will feel that. They will feel that they know about Kathleen Pettigrew, but they still won't be able to have kind of touched her, sort of what she was like as a woman. I mean, you can infer various things, that she was obviously very intelligent, very bright, incredibly hardworking, incredibly good at her job, in terms of just basing that on her career progression and the length of time that she worked for MI6. You can probably determine that she was discreet, that she was loyal. I mean, most of these women in the book, I would say, are cut from a different piece of the cloth to the rest of women at the time, because they are unassuming, they are loyal, they are discreet. And it's quite hard to wrap your head around now in the 21st century when we are bombarded with misinformation and taught to be cynical and not trust everything that we read, hear, or see when it comes to a particular country and the government that you're living under. These women believe emphatically in the British state. Whatever the British state deemed or decreed, they believed in it emphatically. They were completely patriotic and loyal. And again, I think that's always something interesting to reflect on in terms of the difference from then to now.
They seem like a very special group. I know you mentioned a eureka moment. In terms of when you were researching the book and when you were sitting in the archives, were there other just wow moments for you?
There were so many. Some of them took place in the archive, and it's really hard to kind of go, yippee, because you get told off to shush. But there were many moments, sometimes very small things, sometimes very big things. So I think the biggest eureka moments were when I had tracked down family relatives of women, and they had revealed that they had this kind of fantastic private collection, which included diaries, letters, and relating to the period of time that they either worked in MI6, MI5, or any of the wartime services. So that was incredible because most of the women, the relatives that I contacted, they told very similar stories that, several months before the women died, they had several bonfires, and your heart sinks when you hear that story. But it was a story that I heard repeated again and again because these women, they had signed the Official Secrets Act and they stuck to it. They never shared anything about their wartime or their secret service. World War II veterans were slightly more open in terms of family stories, and especially the Bletchley Park veterans. But I think probably one of the eureka moments that kind of stands out for me was there is a lady who has a whole chapter to herself in the book, and Winnie Spink. She's the first MI6 woman to be sent to Petrograd in 1916, and she is the only woman working in what was the MI6 office, which was called the British Intelligence Mission in Petrograd. And she's there right up until and after the Russian Revolution. So it's incredibly hard posting to endure. But she was utterly brilliant. But she kept this fantastic diary and very, very candid in her entries as well, which I'll leave the reader to find out when they read the chapter. It'll certainly make you smile. She was a woman born before the world was ready for her. I think if she'd been born at the other end of the 20th century, she may have been the first female prime minister of this country, but she was absolutely fantastic. But in her diary, one of the eureka moments was I was getting to the entries around about the time that Rasputin was murdered. And some of your listeners, subscribers may be familiar with the story of British intelligence involvement in the death of Rasputin, and which happened at the end of December 1916, of which his death was reported at the beginning of January 1917. And on the night that he is lured to Prince Yusupov's palace, where he's murdered, essentially, and there are British intelligence officers that are there, including a chap called MI6 officer called Oswald Rayner, who supposedly pulled the trigger himself, as it's reported. On that night, Winnie records in her diary, which is a rather out of character entry, that she took a joyride in the mission car around Petrograd. Now, it's a really odd entry to have in there, and it kind of just struck me. And when I first opened the diary, on the front page there were just a few lists of key dates and addresses that obviously were very important to her. One was the date that women got the vote in Britain in 1918. She was a former suffragette, so an incredibly strong advocate for women's equality. And then the other details, there were two other lines of handwriting, and one of them was the addresses of the cafes that Rasputin would frequent in Petrograd, along with his address, which I thought, gosh, that's slightly odd. And then when I got to this entry about the joyride in the mission car, there was only one mission car, it seemed interesting. And when I tallied up the dates and realised it was the date, the evening that Rasputin's murder occurred, I suddenly had that eureka moment, because just that small piece of anecdotal information was key, because basically the inference is that to take away any suspicion from British involvement, of British intelligence being involved, Rasputin's body was transported by a similar type of car from the palace when it was dumped through an ice hole in the river, to which then it was later found. The reason why she took a joyride in the mission car was so that that was an alibi. That car couldn't have possibly been used to move Rasputin's body if it was seen around Petrograd driving erratically with a woman and another driver who were driving it, having fun and having a joyride. It was provided British intelligence with an alibi. So that was a real kind of eureka moment in terms of, the Russian Revolution, Rasputin's murder, those key historical events. And here was Winnie Spink being one of those actors within history. It's quite incredible as a historian to find those small pieces of information which suddenly make the picture a bit clearer.
Understandable. I guess then going back to, being in the archives, doing the research, was there a discovery that challenged what you thought you knew about women in British intelligence?
Well, I think during the course of my research, at the very beginning, I'd started off with the assumption that in terms of social class, it was mainly women from the upper middle classes and upper classes that were working in Britain's secret services, because they were the daughters of admirals, army officers, or they may be the daughters, nieces, granddaughters, and it was that extension of trust. And because they had they'd been to finishing school, which you would need French for, they had languages. Some of them later on had been university educated. So there was this sort of perception of social class wise that they were the kind of large group of women that were employed in British intelligence. But one of the things that slowly started to become very clear was that it actually was all the social classes of women were involved. And within the book, I say from cleaner to codebreaker that you do have working class women who work in British intelligence and are able to have a career and progress, which is incredible. So within MI6, it was possible, if we take the example of Beatrice Peters, she starts as a very young woman, perhaps at the end of the First World War, working as a messenger in a She then progresses to working on the telephones, which is incredibly, you've got to be trusted to be working on the switchboard. You can listen into conversations and it would never be known. So she manages to make that jump. You also have women like Kathleen Pettigrew, who, when we watch James Bond films, and we see Miss Moneypenny, she's wearing her pearls, her hair is perfectly put up, and she gives the impression that she's being brought up and schooled how to hold a champagne glass, coming from the upper classes, that she may have been a former debutante. Well, in fact, the real woman who was the inspiration for Miss Moneypenny, Kathleen Pettigrew, was from a working class background. She came from Bermondsey in London. Her grandfather was a Bermondsey geezer. I think as a teenager, he was convicted of theft, got 6 months in prison, including 6 lashes of the whip, which is not the kind of background that the upper class women were coming from. But Kathleen Pettigrew was that working class woman who was a professional woman, a woman who wanted to carve out her own career and have economic independence. And she was able to do that. But her origins were very much working class. So I think perhaps that was the biggest surprise, was that women in intelligence are not just working in the good jobs, if you want to call it that. They're working in every type of job, which includes cleaners. I found examples of cleaners at Bletchley Park. They would go in at certain points early in the morning, and those working in the huts were told that the night before they had to roll up any important wall charts or wall maps that might perhaps be charting Hitler's wolf pack, the submarines in the Atlantic, which of course they're able to do because they're listening into the enemy, decrypting their messages, and able to produce these charts which have got their movement on, but they're told before the cleaners in, you've got to roll them up. I then found within naval intelligence, naval officers writing at the end of the war memoirs, and a couple of them talk about the importance of the cleaning ladies and how their positivity sort of caused positivity in everybody else, but also their hard work in ensuring that the building was kept clean, which obviously helps to having a more productive workforce, because of course you don't want dirty surroundings, because people that work there are going to complain. So every woman in those types of roles, they all play a part, because intelligence work is essentially teamwork. And I think sometimes that gets lost within some histories. So every role is performed by a woman. And of course that covers the full spectrum of social classes doing so.
But it's interesting because it does seem like the way intelligence is portrayed in media is much more individual. So it's really interesting to hear your perspective on it being a teamwork. Claire, as a final question, what stands out as you think of women in British intelligence over the years?
What stands out? Well, I just think they are an incredible bunch of women. I think their stories are inspirational in terms of what they achieved. And I think ultimately they deserve far greater recognition, which is one of the motivations for writing this book, was to get their stories out there. But it's hard to sort of summarize in a couple of sentences. I just think they play key roles at key moments, and they never had any egos or desire to write memoirs or shout about what they had achieved, and they took their secrets to the grave. And I think that in itself is remarkable. I always wonder whether Kathleen Pettigrew, how she would feel about her featuring in the book and her story being told. I'd like to think that if she had been alive, that she probably would have lambasted me for breaking her then perhaps gone away secretly and smiled at the fact, yes, her story and her work has actually been recognised. So yes, I like to take kind of solace in that fact, and fingers crossed that's what it would have actually been.
These are very, very important stories to tell. Do you feel like there's something important that we didn't talk about yet, and you feel like we should be talking about it?
Well, I think in terms of women's experience in intelligence, and in particular, the thing that I wasn't able to find evidence of in time to write in the book in terms of enough, is actually when you asked about the experience of men and women in intelligence. I think there is something distinct about the women's experience, just as being a woman, especially when it comes to the courageous SOE agents that went behind enemy lines during the Second World War. And it comes down to things like, what was it like to be a female agent behind enemy lines and you had your period as a woman? I could not find anything about that. Now, whether they were given various drugs, uppers and downers. Very many of them needed to stay awake for very long periods of time, which puts extreme stress on the body. Perhaps they had drugs that stopped women having their period when they were working behind enemy lines. I'm not sure. But the thing that I find most interesting is when it comes to these women, that sometimes doesn't get highlighted enough in terms of their experience and the sacrifices that they made. Obviously, a large number of them didn't come home because they were murdered, executed, but their stories thankfully have been told. Some are more well known than others, so there's still some more work to be done. But women like Virginia Hall, who started off as an SOE agent, then she was an American, then went to work for the OSS, Office of Strategic Service, and then went into the CIA post-war. After the war, she was unable to have children of her own. And it's pretty certain that it's because of the extreme stress that her body as a woman was put under in terms of working as an agent behind enemy lines. All the drug taking, the malnutrition, the extreme exercise, and of course she did this with Cuthbert, her fake prosthetic leg, which is incredible just thinking about it. But she was unable to have children, and there were a number of other women who suffered this same fate, probably because of their work during the war. So of course this is another sacrifice that women had to make. And I think sometimes this aspect, when it comes to women's experience, I think that needs a lot more work done on it. But I haven't been able to find the records that really kind of shed any light on that. So I'm interested to look at that in the future. And if anybody has come across that, because I couldn't find it in time for the book, there are various things mentioned in the book in terms of female experience. Yeah, I always think that's an interesting one.
Hopefully it'll be a story to be told by you in the future.
Fingers crossed.
Well, thank you for bringing the stories of these remarkable women to the public, for us to all learn about them. And thank you for coming out to the podcast. It's been really great having you.
No, thank you. Thank you for giving me this wonderful platform to share these women's stories. Thank you.